Hello everyone. For this project, our group analyzed A Valentine by Edgar Allan Poe.
Our group came to a conclusion that this poem's speaker is Edgar Allan Poe because it's written for his lover, Frances Osgood.
This poem is one of many in which Poe wrote during the Gothic period of America.
Our group concluded that the poem was written for his lover, Frances Sargent Osgood.
Within the poem, Poe included a hidden name that lies throughout the work. As it can be inferred, this name is Frances Sargent Osgood, but the name isn't just spelled out in a random place within the poem. There is one letter for each line of the poem. Seeing that Frances Osgood is 20 letters in total, the poem has 20 lines in total as well. But then Poe takes it one step further and makes the process of finding her name more complicated. As the poem goes on, Poe hides the letters of her name deeper and deeper into the poem, as if a long hunt looking for some secret treasure. For example, the first letter of her name, which is F, is the first letter of the first line of the poem, and the second letter of her name, which is R, is the second letter of the second. The pattern continues throughout the whole entire poem until he manages to spell out her name entirely, beginning to end, within the poem. For Poe to have being able to done this, he would have started with her name and then written the poem around her name, and this is why it's a major aspect of the structure of the poem. There are also two very minor aspects of the poem that are classified as structure, and these would be the meter and the rhyme of the poem. The meter within the poem is mainly steady throughout the entire poem, and there's barely any breaks in the meter. The rhyme scheme of the poem is alternating rhyme of A-B, A-B, and there are some parts where the I rhyme is present. As well as the meter, the rhyme scheme does not play a significant part of defining the figurative meaning of this poem.
Seeing that this poem is written by Poe for his lover, it can be interpreted that the language of this poem would be playful and affectionate. To start off with the more literal side of the poem, the language that is used in the literal sense is playful. This can be seen as literal because playful has a definition of amusement and games, and this can be seen as the words and sentences within the poem contains multiple clues towards a deeper meaning within. As discussed before, the literal purpose for this poem is to find the name of Frances Sargent Osgood. Poe uses words and phrases that are like little clues that help the analyzer find the name within the poem. That is, if the analyzer is able to find the purpose in the first place. As seen in line 1, for her this rhyme is penned, he is beginning to introduce the poem and creates a scavenger hunt-like aspect where the true meaning and next step are not fully understood. In this part of the first line, Poe is referring to Frances Sargent Osgood, and this is like the first clue that he gives the analyzer that what they are looking for is her name. Also, within line 16, Poe writes, "Of poets, by poets," as the name is a poet's too. He is saying that this poem is written by poets, but it is written for a poet who is referred to within the poem. Obviously, Poe himself is a poet, but the knowledge that most people do not possess is that Frances Sargent Osgood herself was a poet as well. This all comes into focus since Poe is writing this poem for a poet and her name is already secretly hidden within the poem. This is also another clue because he is again referring to the name. As said before, Frances Sargent Osgood was a poet herself. Stepping over to the more figurative side of things, the language that is used within the poem is affectionate. Since Poe is writing this poem for and about his lover, there needs to be some sort of affection present or it would not make sense for it to be for his lover. Poe writes in line 3, "Shall find her own sweet name that nestling lies." He is saying that her eyes, referenced in the previous line, shall find her name that is hidden within the poem. This is seen as affectionate language because he uses the word sweet, and the word sweet has a positive connotation, and when associated with a person, that person is then seen as a positive and caring person by others. Poe is describing his lover as an amazing person, as this is what is usually seen within a love poem.
Poe's unique poetic technique is developed mainly from poetic conventions used throughout the poem. Poe originally incorporates conventions to discreetly make the poem take the form of a love letter. For example, in line 2, Poe writes, brightly expressive as the twins of Leda. He is saying that the eyes of his lover are very bright and beautiful like the stars, since her eyes were mentioned in the previous line. Poe is trying to get the reader to imagine looking into the stars and being able to see the same beauty from the stars as one can see from the eyes of Francis Sargent Osgood. The twins of Leda are two mythological beings, with their mother being Leda, but they had two separate fathers. The one father was Castor, who was the mortal son of Tyndareus, and Pollux, who was the son of Zeus. Poe incorporates this illusion by referring to mythology to create a comparison. It must be known that this illusion also refers to the constellations of the twins of Leda. The illusion creates a comparison between the stars and Francis Osgood's eyes. Poe's extreme comparison compares two very different things to create a simile. The twins, or the stars, are taking the place of her eyes in the illusion. The known brightness of stars develops the visual imagery used to describe his lover's eyes. Poe also writes in lines 10 to 12, and yet there is no Gordian knot which one might not undo without a saber, if one could merely comprehend the plot. He writes that the plot is not hard to understand, and a tool is not needed to figure it out. There is an old story about the Gordian knot and Alexander the Great. The story refers to the Gordian knot, which is a knot tied by the current emperor of China, and was supposed to only be undone by the next emperor. But Alexander the Great cut it apart with his sword. The symbolism shows that there is nothing between the reader and the true meaning behind the poem. There is also the convention of simile present within the poem, and these similes are used to compare items to other items. Without Poe's use of simile, the poem would lack many of the comparisons used to hint at a hidden meaning within the poem. This can be seen in lines 17 to 18. Its letters, although naturally lying, like the knight Pinto, Mendez Ferdinando. And by Poe putting in this simile, he is comparing the letters within the poem to the knight named Mendez Ferdinando. Mendez Ferdinando was a well-known traveler from 1909 to 1983, but he was also well known for exaggerating about what he observed during his trials. This is relating back to how Francis Sargent Osgood's name is naturally hidden within the poem, but lying, since the words within the poem do not have the same true meaning as their literal meaning. Inversion is also a prominent convention that is present in the poem and also makes the poem have a more affectionate tone, as it is a love letter. Inversion is where a normal sentence is taken and then flipped around so that it may seem backwards, such as when Yoda speaks in the Star Wars movies. In line 5, Poe writes, "Search narrowly the lines." He is saying that Francis Sargent Osgood needs to look closely and in between the lines, so to speak, in order to find her name, which is the main purpose of the poem. In this instance, he is playing with the words in a playful way, which fits into the description of how the figurative language within the poem takes on an affectionate tone. Also, in line 7, Poe writes, "That must be worn at the heart. Search well the measure." And in this line, he is referring to her finding her name by saying she should search through the poem. The inversion brings attention to yet another clue to the name hidden within the poem. By using inversion in the poem, it makes the poem's overall tone more similar to that of a conventional love letter, and adds an element of affection because he's playing with the words and teasing her.
When style is used in literature, it is all the language, structure, and technique combined into one to determine the way that in which a writer is writing his or her piece. Overall, Poe's work is a great example of lyric poetry. When the reader gets past the vague literal meaning of the poem, he or she can see that Poe is expressing his feelings for Francis Osgood throughout this poem. Underneath many of these comparisons that Poe uses lie Poe's affection for his lover, which are portrayed through those comparisons and allusions. The meaning of this poem is mostly expressed through comparisons, which depicts Francis's beauty and Poe's love for Francis.